So with no further ado, we have an awesome speaker today. His name is Jaq Payne, and Jaq is a master's student in UT School of Natural Resources studying urban forestry under Dr. Sharon Jean-Philippe. They received their associate degree of science and arts from Northwestern Michigan Community College and their bachelor's degree in integrated studies with a focus on theater and leadership from Middle Tennessee State University. Before attending UT, they held a range of jobs, including nannying, teaching children how to eat fire at a circus camp in Germany, which sounds really awesome. As a parent, maybe a little scary, and project management and safety coordination at a plastics recycling plant. They are now the co-director of the Tennessee Champion Tree Program, which is an awesome program, by the way, which measures and records the largest specimen of each tree species in the state of Tennessee. Their MS research focuses on laying the groundwork for the implementation of an urban food forest in a historically underserved area of Knoxville. And with that, I give you Jaq.
Thank you so much. Let me get my presentation up for y'all. Here we go. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna hide all these faces and just get started. So first off, thank you so much to Alyssa and Deb and to One Health for having me, and to the rest of y'all for joining us to talk about urban food forestry and how we can use it to build the resilience of communities. Before I get started, I want to dedicate this presentation to my friend and mentor who passed away this last September, Dr. Sid Elizabeth Hamilton, whose work in ecological and social justice continues to inspire me. Like they said, my name is Jaq. I'm going to take us through what an urban food forest is, a brief history of food forestry, the unique challenges of the urban environment, how urban food forestry can address some of those challenges, and then wrap up with a little bit about what to consider when implementing a food forest in your own community. So first off, what even is urban food forestry? My favorite definition is that it is the ancient practice of modeling urban agriculture after the structure of the forest, with all of the biodiversity and complexity that implies. We're thinking about a multi-layer canopy full of a diverse range of plants working together in community. In the 1980s, this 7-layer concept pictured here was developed. Breaking this down layer by layer, we have canopy trees, the highest layer, the largest trees. We're thinking honey locusts, persimmons, pecans, mulberries. We've got the mid-story layer of smaller fruit trees and larger shrubs like serviceberries, dwarf fruit trees, coppiced beech. Coppicing a tree is when you cut it off near the ground, which allows the tree to grow many thin stems rather than one thick stem. Historically, that was used for making rods and sticks before we had machines and lathes to do so easily. Next, we have the small shrub layer of stuff like blackberries and chokeberries, raspberries. The herbaceous layer follows after that with a huge variety of possibilities from comfrey, bee balm, sage or salvia, tomatoes, peppers, just pretty much any herbaceous plant that you can think of. Next, the rhizosphere, including root vegetables and other perennial plants with useful roots like barberries, whose roots make a good dye, and they have some medicinal purposes too. Then we've got the living mulch and ground covers like wild ginger and strawberries. And then finally, the vertical layer of climbing vines like grapes. We've got our native muscadine grapes that are a good choice here, or clematis, Dutchman's pipe, any kind of climbing, flowering, fruiting vine. Just like in a forest grown with less human intervention, all of these layers contribute in different ways to the health of the overall forest. So this 7-layer concept came from the 80s. It's pretty new, but like I said, this is an ancient practice. From the pollen record, we've been able to show that around 4,500 years ago, indigenous peoples in the Amazon combined annual crops, perennial forest species, and aquatic resources to create sustainable agriculture, altering the existing landscape to encourage native species to flourish. They did so through fire regimes and physically shaping the land, burning away the overgrowth to make space for their desired edible species. Even today, areas of the Amazon overflow with edible abundance far beyond what would occur naturally without human intervention in that space. Agroforestry is another word for this broad concept of growing both trees and herbaceous crops in the same space. In the history of North America, the indigenous Americans were practicing this form of agriculture across the continent before the colonizers came. The newcomers didn't recognize what was happening as agriculture. Things weren't growing in neat rows or being tended by male farmers. To the untrained eye, the edible species looked like an untended forest. This forest garden, this sustainable form of agriculture, was the result of millennia of oral tradition, scientific processes, testing hypotheses, and determining the best way to approach feeding your community. I've heard from indigenous scientists that there are stories within their cultures of the tribes who did not learn how to sustainably and reliably feed their people, and how those societies collapsed. This knowledge was hard won and anything but quote unquote primitive. It follows the path of history as humans and hominids and plants evolved alongside each other, and evolution is the greatest engineer. It's a very old idea to look at the world around us and to learn from the way things naturally occur. In modern times, we're building drones based on the way that bees fly and robots that move and act like dogs, but we've been learning from nature for forever. One of the terms used for this type of land management is indigenous stewardship methods. Stewardship is a little bit different than natural resource management as a concept. Use of the word resource for the living and non-living things in our environment implies an extractive relationship. What can we get from nature rather than a reciprocal relationship? What can we get with nature? What can we build in conjunction with nature in relationship with nature? Indigenous communities used and use ecological knowledge passed down generation by generation, centered in this idea of connectivity to all living and non-living things. We are connected not only to each other, but to the land itself and the plants and animals that live on it. In addition to this spatial connection in the moment, there's a temporal connection as well. There is an unbroken thread running from the past through the present to the future. I've heard it said that the future is the past altered by the present. A parallel arises here from the Buddhist tradition in using mindfulness to be fully seated in that connectivity. Thich Nhat Hanh shared a gatha, or verse that he recites while eating. It goes like this. In the dimension of space and time, we chew as rhythmically as we breathe, maintaining the lives of all our ancestors, opening an upward path for descendants. So when we eat mindfully, we can be in direct contact with our ancestors as well as our descendants, and use the time of eating to see how we can nourish the best things our ancestors have passed on to us, and how to continue to transmit what is most precious to future generations. Alan Watts has this spectacular quote, "We speak of coming into this world. We didn't. We came out of it like leaves from the tree. We are not separate from nature. Nature is not something that happens out there outside of our office windows. We are a part of nature, and it is happening all the time, everywhere." Wisdom is another important aspect of Indigenous stewardship. Wisdom is the place that lies beyond intellectual knowledge. There's an old saying, knowledge is the awareness that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is choosing not to put it in a fruit salad. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing, right? It's not enough to have the tool. We have to know when and how to use it. Building wisdom takes time, experience, and the ability to listen, understand, and collaborate. Some wisdom we have to learn the hard way in the school of hard knocks, but some wisdom is passed down from others to us, sparing us some of that firsthand suffering. This passing down of knowledge about the world, about us and our place in the world, is sometimes referred to as traditional ecological knowledge. It's the kind that you're much more likely to receive from a conversation than from a book, but if you're interested in learning more about it, a good starting point is the NCRS publication, Indigenous Stewardship Methods and NCRS Conservation Practices, linked here at the bottom of this slide. That outlines some of these principles I've been talking about. And I would also point you to the spectacular works of Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose work, especially this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, deeply inspires and informs my worldview. Urban food forestry as a concept is the result of these historical practices and lines of thinking applied to the urban environment. Academically speaking, it's a brand new concept. It was only introduced as a term to academia in 2013 in this paper, Introducing Urban Food Forestry. I mentioned before that agroforestry is another word for this broad concept, but there are specific challenges facing urban environments that the term agroforestry doesn't fully address. I generally divide these challenges into two categories, biological and social. So first, the biological challenges of the urban environment. We are operating in soils that are highly disturbed and in areas that face a lot of interference from the human element. Apparently, to some people, small trees look very kickable and large trees look very carvable. I've heard that our city's urban foresters simply cannot get trees to maturity in Fort Sanders due to drunken college students knocking the saplings down and damaging them beyond their ability to recover. The soil, air, and water in our urban spaces is often contaminated with heavy metals and other toxins. The soil is frequently compacted from human activity, which prevents plant roots from being able to take up the oxygen and nutrients they need to survive. And finally, we usually have very little space to plant, and that small, difficult space is highly valued by developers looking to turn a profit. In terms of social challenges, there are two major things that come to mind for me. Number one, the history of redlining in America, and number two, as my research is centered around a low-income public housing community, the social environment of the impoverished areas of our cities. This is a scan of the 1940 residential security map created by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board Division of Research and Statistics for Knoxville, laid over a current map of Knoxville to give some context and location. On this map, you can see the city is divided into areas and given a creditworthiness rating, A through D, where A in green is best, B in blue is still desirable, C in yellow is definitely declining, and D in red is hazardous. Those areas marked in red are referred to as redlined communities. Redlined communities were considered undesirable areas filled with low-wage workers and often immigrants and Black communities. You can visit the Mapping Inequality website and see exactly how these lines were drawn. Some of the racist language and ideas used in these documents is shocking to us today. For people living in redlined areas, lenders and banks wouldn't provide mortgages, loans, or lines of credit, which greatly impacted their ability to buy homes and build generational wealth. As these communities decline due to lack of public and private investment, the repercussions of redlining are still felt today. Here is the CAC needs assessment in 2020 showing census tracts in Knoxville that have more than 40% of the population below the poverty line. It's a near perfect match for most of those redlined communities. You can see that the places that have been redlined, rated C or D in that previous map, now hold some of the highest share of the population below the poverty line. In fact, a recent study in Baltimore showed that communities that have been rated poorly with a C or D on that residential security map are now in the 2020s experiencing a shorter life expectancy as compared to the A and B neighborhoods by 4 to 5 years. That's significant, especially considering the racial and class lines that led to these divisions. Not only are these areas more likely to be poor, they're also more likely to be hot. Here's a chart showing land surface temperatures in 2020 organized by their security rating. Areas rated C or D, yellow or red, are significantly hotter than the green areas rated A. And I mean green in every sense of the word. The wealthy areas of town where people were able to secure generational wealth and public and private investments generally have stronger, better vegetation. This is a heat map of Knoxville created by the Knoxville Heat Equity Coalition this year. Once again, we see how well it lines up with the redlining map. You might notice in this map that it also follows the highways. Those red areas, the hottest spots, are definitely concentrated around those major through lines. In 2020, Deborah Archer published White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes, Advancing Racial Equity Through Highway Reconstruction, in which she details how officials from the federal and state governments used the highway expansion program to target Black communities on purpose, bulldozing their homes, churches, schools, and thriving businesses. Sometimes even entire communities were sacrificed in the name of connecting the majority white suburbs with the center of the city. In St. Paul, Minnesota, the construction of I-94 displaced 1/7 of the Black residents in the city. As you can see, the connection between redlining and the current environmental and economic situations is abundantly clear. Injustice yesterday still affects us today in a myriad of seen and unseen ways. These legacies are felt deeply in our public housing communities as well. This chart shows the average annual household income for all of Knoxville, around $40,000 a year. And then for the specific community that I'm studying and working with, Western Heights. The average income annually in Western Heights is around $9,000 a year. Obviously, that does not leave a lot of money for pressed juices and kombucha from Whole Foods, right? They don't even have a Whole Foods in the neighborhood. They have a Dollar General, which is actually one of the most expensive stores in the area. So financial resources in these areas are really limited. When it comes to what kind of labor resources are available, in Western Heights, the average length of stay is around 3.5 years. Obviously, we hope that for most people, public housing can be a transitional place, a safe landing pad while you get your feet underneath you. But there are many people who, in our current system, will never be able to get their feet under them. Some of those numbers are the working poor, people who are fully employed but not receiving enough money to fully meet their needs. These are often people who lack generational wealth and the ability to or opportunity to build generational wealth. Some of the long-term residents experience a physical or mental disability that prevents them from being a part of the productive workforce and sustaining themselves through employment. But when thinking about putting a community food forest into this space, those individual abilities can limit participation in the food forest. Who wants to come home after an 8-hour minimum wage shift and pull weeds? How do we include people with limited time and energy to devote to a community venture? Who can navigate a forested space? And how can we create spaces that accommodate multiple levels of ability? Everyone, regardless of ability or physical and mental capability, deserves dignity and care, and the opportunity to participate in community spaces and activities. Unfortunately, in general, we don't afford people living in poverty, dignity, and care, meaning that poverty is a deeply traumatic experience. In this excellent paper, The Trauma of Poverty as a Social Identity by Nancy Hudson, she discusses these aspects that lead to deeply ingrained trauma, the fear of shame or scarcity or of not meeting expectations, the desire to keep up appearances, and the immense struggle to do so. The inevitable public humiliation faced, especially in the school environment, where kids are singled out for not being able to afford quality clothes, to not being able to afford glasses, to not being able to complete homework because the home is not a safe or comfortable or quiet place to work. All of this feeds into the social rejection of impoverished people and underserved populations. We, as humans, have needs that extend beyond our biology into our deeply held need to be loved, to be seen, and to belong. This is some pretty heavy stuff, and it's complex. These are not the type of problems that can be solved by any one single venture, idea, or organization, but thinking about these ideas as we build our communities can help us put our energy and resources into concepts that help ease multiple problems at the same time. Let's get into how urban food forestry can address some of these challenges. First, the biological environment. Community is more than just people. We often talk about plant communities. Food forestry is centered around this idea of emulating the forest structure, a large community of diverse species in a small space using the resources efficiently. This means that no one pest or disease can wipe out the entire crop planted. There are many crops, and not only does their diversity offer some inherent protection, companion planting can provide even more benefits like attracting pests away from desirable crops, attracting parasitoids that munch up the pests, and even bolstering the immune system of nearby plants. A direct example of this from my life that I had recently, I had some volunteer goldenrod pop up in my garden. I didn't intentionally plant it, it just showed up. I'm always happy to have a volunteer in that space, but it got these little red bugs all over the top of it. At first I was like, oh, ew, yuck. But then I got curious, looked it up. Turns out these are red goldenrod aphids, and they're specialists, so they only feed on goldenrods, and they don't do a ton of damage. The plant is still able to flower and still able to produce seeds. The predators that eat these aphids, however, ladybugs and some others, are not specialists. They will eat any aphids. So by leaving these harmless bugs alone, by having the goldenrod planted close to some of the plants that I put there intentionally, the predators that are attracted by these bright red bugs, once they've cleared out those populations, will then continue to munch on the other aphids in my garden, protecting all the plants that I put there on purpose. Tree fruit generally has lower concentrations of pollution as compared to herbaceous crops. Much of the heavy metals taken up by tree roots and leaves are stored in all of the non-edible areas of the tree, the trunk, the branches, the leaves. But if you're thinking about a lettuce, most of the toxins are in the part that you're eating because it's the whole plant and it's directly touching the soil. There has been some conflicting evidence on this one, especially in highly polluted environments. There was a study that came out of China that showed unacceptably high levels of heavy metals in some of their inner city tree fruit, but it's worth a mention and seems to be effective in medium or low polluted environments. Additionally, having islands of flowering plants and trees allows pollinators to navigate the urban environment successfully. Our fresh food relies on these community members being able to survive the long haul across town. Imagine for a second that you are a bee in the middle of the city. Where can you land? Where will you have habitat and food and protection from predators? The more little pockets of pollinator oasis we can provide across the city, the more we can connect these pollinator pathways through our urban environment, the more fruitful our gardens will be. And finally, diverse plantings benefit the soil. Trees provide all sorts of soil services. Strong-rooted plants like comfrey and daikon radishes can help break up compacted soils and help nutrients move through the soil horizons. This is depicted in this image here, where they refer to this practice as biodrilling, using biological crops to drill into the earth. And well-established food forests can rely less on mechanical tilling of the soil, allowing the soil structure to remain intact and to support life long-term. Food forests are often focused on utilizing native species that fit well in the microclimates that they're planted in. Putting the right tree and the right plants in the right place reduces maintenance costs and moves toward that vision of a more self-sustaining urban ecosystem. A good food forest plan also thinks about the future. Some of you might know this fun fact about trees. They start small and then they get bigger. Planning for the expectation of what the tree will look like several years down the road is important to make sure that the space is used efficiently. Additionally, we're thinking not so much about what we'll plant in the next few seasons, although that is important and is considered, but what will the forest look like when our children are grown and inheriting the land that we've been borrowing from them? Food forests can be a highly efficient use of the small spaces available to urban farmers. Next, the social environment. Urban food forests are focused on building community and strengthening community access to fresh food. This quote by Bell Hooks changed my life. Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. This sentiment runs beneath my understanding of the social aspect of food forestry and how the plant and animal communities can interact to improve our well-being. The quantity of green spaces in a neighborhood has been linked to increased mental health, decreased mortality, and also reduction in some types of crime. In Philadelphia in the early 2000s, they converted vacant lots to green spaces, and in those areas they saw reduction in vandalism, reduction in criminal mischief, and reduction in gun assaults. This is an approach to increasing community safety outside of traditional policing. Instead of only putting resources toward dealing with community harm after it happens, we can help build safe, healthy, and strong communities from the ground up. And these green spaces are uniquely positioned to address our mental and physical well-being. Research shows that there are all these benefits: recovery from fatigue, reduction in stress and aggression, restoration of attention, reduced impact of depression, anxiety, sadness, anger. To quote this paper cited here, results indicate that the difference in depressive symptoms between an individual living in an environment with no tree canopy and an environment with 100% tree canopy is larger than the difference in symptoms associated with an individual who is uninsured compared to an individual with private insurance. These folks write like I write, extremely wordy. I want to read that one again because I think it's important. Results indicate that the difference in depressive symptoms between an individual living in an environment with no tree canopy and an environment with 100% tree canopy is larger than the difference in symptoms associated with an individual who is uninsured compared to an individual with private insurance. It's hard to figure out exactly what the mechanism behind these results are. Some people claim it's the increased physical activity benefiting the mental state. Some cite the chemical impact of volatile organic carbons, those chemicals released from trees, plants, and soil. Did y'all know we are better at smelling fertile soil after a rain than sharks are at smelling blood in the water? We are finely tuned, extremely sensitive to those volatile organic carbons. The benefits listed here could also be due to having a stronger connection to social networks, like in-person, real-life social networks, not the online kind. The opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's purpose. The opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. A place like a community food forest can provide people with both purpose and connection. When you plant something in the ground, when you water it and tend it, you form a relationship with that plant. If you have ever had overzealous mowers chomp up your beloved garden, you know the kind of grief that can bring. Not only do we feel responsible for the beings that we nurture, we feel connected to them. And that's just the human-plant relationship. I always say you start off pulling weeds next to a stranger and you end up pulling weeds next to a friend. The impact of these connections cannot be overstated. These kinds of relationships save lives. By providing dedicated community space with a common goal or purpose, we are strengthening communities through action, not just through words. These senses of purpose and connection can also help us in the communal processing of grief. Eco-grief, I'm willing to bet that some of the folks on this Zoom are familiar with this concept, but it's a fairly new term in academic literature. In 2018, Consolo and Ellis examined it as the impact of climate change on mental health, comprised of three overlapping categories. First, grief associated with the physical loss of species, ecosystems, landscapes, both as part of the slow degradation of our world due to climate change and in the wake of more acute events like natural disasters or extreme weather events, which are more common in a warming world. Second, the loss of environmental knowledge and identity. For example, farmers losing their ability to recognize seasonal rhythms as they change, the loss of traditional ecological knowledge through elders dying without having been able to pass their knowledge on, or the inability of elders to provide advice that is relevant because weather conditions and travel routes have been so deeply impacted by our changing world that their information is no longer usable. Finally, the third category, the grief associated with anticipated future losses. Anxiety over disappearing ways of life, rising drought conditions threatening our food and water security in the long term, rising sea levels swallowing up our coastal cities, and imagining iconic monuments sinking into the sea. Some of these forms of grief are hard to articulate, hard to pin down. Researchers refer to this as ambiguous grief. Taken as a whole, all of these impacts of climate change are fully outside of our individual control. And because of the modern news cycle, we are more exposed to more information about these problems than ever before. The sense of hopelessness and helplessness that arises from that can lead to nihilism, the sense of why even bother, nothing we do matters. That nihilism can be paralyzing and can prevent us from seeing the good that can be done and that is being done. When we participate in community-based initiatives and events, when we give of ourselves to our community and are the recipients of gifts from our community, that connection strengthens our sense that we are contributing tangibly to a better life for others in this concrete way. In Dr. Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I mentioned earlier, she quotes somebody else as saying, "The price of an ecological education is the ability to see the invisible wounds of the world." I had the joy of getting to virtually attend a book talk by Dr. Kimmerer a couple of years back, and when it came time for the audience to ask questions, my question was this: the more I learn about ecology, about the state of the world, the more grief I feel. How do we deal with that grief and continue to do the work ahead of us? Dr. Kimmerer responded with this, paraphrased as best I can recall from memory: "Remember that the depth of the grief that you feel is the direct inverse of the depth of the love that you feel. The only way out is to move through that grief and let it change you. And at the bottom of that grief lies action. Let the grief flow through you and move you to action. And this is the action of it all. We're feeding people. Remember that Snickers ad, "You're not you when you're hungry"? So true. I turn into a monster. People who know me well know to have snacks on hand when I'm in town. There are both physical and mental impacts of being well fed. When we are receiving adequate nutrition, we have stronger immune systems, longer lives, better recovery from injury and illness, and more energy to live and thrive. When we are receiving adequate nutrition, we think better, we learn better, we feel better, pay better attention, and feel generally happier. This means that we perform more effectively in school, at work, in social situations, out in society, and with our loved ones in the home. It's important to ensure that the people living in our community have ample access to fresh and affordable food, and having a food forest directly in the community can help increase that access. Furthermore, by adding more sources of food within a community, we are building more resilient food systems. This is what our system currently looks like in one depiction. Don't let all of these tiny arrows scare you. This is just showing the way that ripple effects can move through our food systems. So here, this bottom diagonal line is showing everybody involved with food systems, from the people that produce food, the farmers, to the people who process it, like washing, chopping, packaging, and then they provide it to retailers, who then transfer it to sellers, who then finally provide it to the consumers. At any step along this process, disruption will travel down the line and back up it. Again, going back to that idea of connectivity. I personally don't usually pay much attention to what's going on with the weather in California, but if an extended drought affects farmers on the West Coast, that limited supply and drop in business impacts everyone all the way down. If retail transportation is facing a labor shortage and can't meet the demand, sellers and consumers feel that impact, as well as the processors holding on to that perishable supply and the farmers they get their raw supply from. Smaller farms that provide food straight to the consumer can bypass a lot of the obstacles on this chart. In times of disruption, they are less affected by all of the problems affecting everybody in the middle there, and add to the diversity of a food system. A diverse system is a resilient system. So now, hopefully, we're all on the same page about why an urban food forest might be a good idea. Let's briefly talk through a few things to think about when implementing an urban food forest of your own. First off, community, community, community. One of the most important factors in building successful food forests appears to be how connected the community feels to that space. Building purposeful community with an intentional understanding of the resources that community has access to, and engaging the community in the whole process of food forest creation and maintenance is vital to the long-term success of establishing an urban food forest. Not only will your network of resources expand, especially when it comes to knowledge and labor and local connections, but that community buy-in can then serve as a buffer to the other threats facing the food forest. Developers have a much harder time convincing the city to hand over land dedicated to urban forests if the community places a large cultural value on that land and advocates on behalf of it at the local level. If you are interested in reading more on this aspect, I would highly recommend the Community Food Forest Handbook, pictured here, How to Plan, Organize, and Nurture Edible Gathering Places by Catherine Bukowski and John Munsell. I actually had to pay our school library $3 for holding on to this book for too long. I absolutely love it. One of my favorites. Working with the land rather than against it is another important consideration. Selecting native species that are appropriate for the microclimate you're planting in will make maintenance of those species easier, as well as benefiting the native urban biodiversity we need to focus on rebuilding. I often say that the earth will tell you what needs to happen in that space if you listen. If you've got an area that floods frequently, plant something there that loves to have its feet wet. Look at the shape of the area you're working in and let that guide the structure of the forest garden, rather than coming up with the design before being able to see how the land has been shaped over the millennia. When you need help with something important, do you ask a stranger on the street or a friend that you know well? Get to know the land you're working with and it will respond in kind. Thinking about your interaction with the land as a reciprocal relationship rather than as an extractive one benefits both the land and the people. In addition to letting the land be your starting point for the design of the food forest, the next step is thinking about plants in community with the other organisms around it. In permaculture, they talk about plant guilds, groups of plants that grow well together and support one another. I love that term, but I actually prefer the word community because I feel that it more fully communicates this aspect of plants interacting with each other and their surrounding environment in ways big and small. I mentioned companion planting briefly earlier, but the classic and famous example of companion planting is the three sisters, corn, squash, and beans. The corn provides structure for the beans to grow upon, the squash provides ground cover to suppress weeds and retain moisture, and the beans fix nitrogen into the soil so that the corn and squash have more nutrients available to help them grow fruitful and strong. Expanding our awareness out from there, the community around those plants includes the pollinators who hold responsibility for setting the fruit and ensuring a quality harvest. It includes the soil microbiome of bacteria, fungi, macro and microinvertebrates that process nutrients and move them from one area to another. It includes us humans, ensuring that there's enough water for growth and that the space is physically protected from predators and disturbance, and that the fruit is harvested when it is most delicious and the seeds are preserved for the next generation of plants. We are an essential part of this community. We are not separate from it. As Hopi farmer Stuart Koyuyumtewa and Hopi NRCS engineer Blythe Koyuyumtewa wrote, "Everything received from the earth is always received with thanks to all living things. It is not the farmer alone who grows the plant. It is the wind and animals that help to pollinate, the sun that gives warmth for growth, the rain that gives moisture for growth, and the farmers and people's heartfelt prayers for just enough food to survive. It is all things." Once you're thinking about the community of plant and non-plant entities and utilizing the space most efficiently based on its natural layout, you are on the way to emulating the structure of the forest. There is complexity and wildness in the forest structure that may look untamed to those who don't know any better, those who have been steeped in the straight lines and bare ground of industrial farming. So it's necessary to use other visual cues to indicate that the space is actively being cared for, to communicate that this is a space that is productive and beloved. Interpretive signage can help with this, clearly delineated borders around pathways and growing areas, and visual art placed throughout the forest garden can all clue people into the fact that this is controlled, intentional chaos and not the unregulated chaos it might appear to be at first glance. This is sometimes called activating the space and can contribute to the safety of an area. And then finally, planning for the future in a real way, not just pipe dreams of beautiful, fruitful land available to all, but asking the hard questions. Where is the money and labor to support this coming from? Not just now, but in 10, 50, 100 years. How can we ease those burdens by connecting with individuals and organizations within and outside the community? What kind of a governance or leadership structure should we put in place so this forest can flourish for generations, long after the founder passes away or leaves the area? How will we build community with this project, and how can community build us in return? What happens if the developers come sniffing around the land? How can we leverage our community resources, our stakeholders, our networks to protect this forest for generations to come? I always say, I am not planting trees for the next 10 to 15 years. I am planting trees for the next 100 years. I am planting trees for our grandchildren's grandchildren and the society that they will inherit from us. Planning for the communities that our descendants will inherit in 100 years requires careful consideration, and it can only be done together. With that, I will wrap it up. My email is here, jaqpayne@utk.edu. My spam filter has been seriously overzealous the past several months, so if you don't get a response, it's not because I don't like you, it's just that the robot managing my email is extremely protective of me. I left a little bit of time here for questions and discussions. I'm curious if any of y'all have had experiences with urban food forests or how these concepts might intersect with the work that you're doing. I've done fair amount of talking here, and I would love to do some listening. Thank you so much for your time.
That was fantastic, Jack. Wow. So awesome. I think we've got a couple questions coming up.
Yeah, there's one in the chat that I'll read for the recording. What is the difference in this connection with nature and permaculture's connection?
Such a good question. It's a deeply connected concept. Unfortunately, in academia, permaculture is a little bit of a dirty word. It's kind of associated with hippies and with unscientific processes. But really, it's a lot of it, there's just so much overlap. Urban food forestry is very specifically focused, again, on that urban environment. That's probably the main difference between urban food forestry and permaculture, but it uses a lot of permaculture concepts because permaculture uses a lot of indigenous concepts. And it's definitely all linked. And yeah, a huge part of my research and my writing has been finding the right jargon to use to explain the permaculture concepts to scientists in a way that helps them take it seriously as an idea, rather than just assuming that it's a bunch of dirty hippies on a farm. It might be that, and that's absolutely valid, but there's a certain level of academic integrity that permaculture can be missing in the conversation.
Awesome. I think people can unmute themselves, right?
Yes, it looks like Ruth raised a hand.
Hi, that was a really great talk. I think this is a really inspiring topic. I was trying to think the whole time you were talking, I was thinking about like how to translate the stuff you're talking about into like calls to action for actually living here. I'm a grad student. I live in a teeny apartment and I don't really have access to like a community green space like the one that you're talking about. And I know that there are some around Knoxville, but I don't know what the best place to start, I guess, would be if I were thinking about trying to contribute to making spaces like this. Like, I'd love to give my time and I'd love to give my care, but I don't know how to start.
Yes, so there's two organizations locally that come to mind for me. The first is Beardsley Community Farm, which is definitely, I'm seeing some nods, definitely more of a tradition, urban agriculture, but they do have some fruit trees and they are really heavily involved in spreading community gardens around town. So getting involved in urban agriculture at all is a great way to start there. Another organization, it's pretty new, it's called Rooted East, ROOTEDEAST. They are awesome. They are doing some work specifically out in East Knoxville and are always looking for help. They've got a bunch of pilot homes where they're putting raised beds in people's yards and really building up that community. So those are the two that come to mind for me first. SEED, SEEED, has a food forest locally. It's a little bit undertended. I think that they face the classic example of most food forests, which is the ongoing labor issue of having enough people to help and enough qualified, experienced folks that can help run it. But if there are people in the community with knowledge, I'm sure that they would be willing to accept that help. So that for sure is a big one. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I think another place that you might be able to look into would be the Sustainable Future Center in South Knox. They're kind of located in South Knoxville, and they've got a lot of stuff that they're working on. I don't know if they have anything specifically food forest related, but they do have urban garden stuff. They've got like a free wood chip pile out back if you need to amend soils or anything like that. And then I think they do something with a food forest, but I don't know how connected they are with it, but that'd be a good place to go as well.
Sounds awesome. Thank you.
Let's see, I see a question from Lucy. How have you found the balance between navigating community and academia? Such a good question. Hi, Lucy. It is really challenging. In fact, I'm in the process of actually switching to a non-thesis program for my master's because there's just deadlines coming up that I'm not going to be able to meet. And a huge part of that is because I've been doing so much community and outreach work over the course of my master's. I think that one of the things that I also notice is the siloing of information, where it's like there are all these people within the university that have all of this incredible knowledge. And we are so lucky to have our extension program that does a fantastic job of moving that knowledge out into the community. But I think that there could be even more done. And of course, it's just very hard because everybody's so busy. And so trying to ask anything else of graduate students and faculty is a big ask. There's a lot going on. it is a challenging balance, definitely taking things slowly, um, and making decisions that benefit my mental health, like the challenging decision to abandon a thesis. So yeah, it's challenging. I see that James posted, and it turns out it's not just Indigenous Americans who grew food forests. The Circassians who lived in the Western Caucasus also did too. I might have mispronounced those words, but yeah, it is truly an ancient idea because we're just looking at the way that
Yeah.
things grow naturally. Do you have more
Yeah.
information on that?
I mean, I did link an article to it, but basically, just as with the Indigenous Americans, a lot of the forests in the area had anomalously high proportions of fruit and nut trees, even long after the removal of the indigenous peoples.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's just such an ancient idea. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Dr. Kimmerer talks about just looking at the way things grow and growing things based on the way that they already grow. So I think that nature as a source of knowledge is ancient and practiced all over the world for sure. Thank you for that. It looks like Adia said, my time managing for a school garden for elementary age students, I was curious to explore how agency for the children to make decisions on what or how the garden looks like is important. Wonder if you came across any research along the lines of agency or control of the environment for people working in community gardens. I can't think of any specific off the top of my head. I would definitely point to the Community Food Forest Handbook that I mentioned by Bukowski and Munsell, because that has a lot of case studies in it of specific gardens where the community was involved and was instrumental in promoting the community garden. I think just in general, there's I can't cite anything specific, but a fair amount of research and just how it changes the space when we feel like we have some control and ownership over it. I think that, and I also think that urban food forestry and this kind of sustainable agriculture is an under-researched area, and there's definitely more room for curious questions like that. Lauren Wells mentioned nature deficit disorder, totally a thing. Holy cow. Green space is important for all. Darby asks, what are your recommendations about communicating this research to policymakers and to our representatives in Congress, state and federal? Do you think it is more effective to work at the local level to make the most impactful changes? That's such a good question.
Yeah.
I think that it has to start on a local level, this kind of movement. And of course has been happening on a local level for a very long time. It's hard to communicate to, when you're, of course, you always have to think of the audience. When we're talking to policymakers, it makes more sense to communicate the economic benefits, like the reduced need for food welfare because they're able to access food within the community. Definitely there's some like health impacts that result in economic savings. It seems like money is the most efficient way to communicate with our policymakers and representatives. Yeah, and I think it depends on which policymaker. It's truly about finding the thing that they value and that they are promoting and then connecting that back to the expanse of things that food forestry covers. Of course, environmentalism is another area that's seen a lot of growth, so that could be a pressure point too. But I think the most impact that I have seen is coming from the local level and just doing what is in your hula hoop and trying to build something that will last a couple generations, which is really challenging. There's a question from Michael. How is food forestry different from urban gardening? The big difference is just that it's centered around trees, that trees are central to the design of the forest garden, and that traditional urban gardening does seem to be more either like landscaping for ornamentals where things are kind of put together in an interesting way, or if you're trying to do a productive garden, it tends to be more like raised beds, which can be a component of a food forest. But with the food forest, we're thinking about the tree and then all the plants under it, and the leaves are living mulch, and we're kind of this cohesive viewing things as an ecosystem rather than as individual pieces going into the ground, which some urban gardeners do it like that, which is awesome. Leanne asked about what about taking this methodology to state parks or municipal parks? I think that would be awesome. I think that they are a little bit afraid of it sometimes. A couple of the issues that we see with growing food trees in public places is that the workers who are responsible for maintaining the space need to be appropriately trained. It can be like a slip and fall hazard if if nobody is harvesting the fruit in time. If the fruit falls and is left unattended, it can attract some pests and wildlife that are undesirable to some folks. I love to see raccoons working with their weird little hands, but not everybody wants to see that in their park. I think that it would be awesome to get more of these concepts out into these spaces and to use those places as connection to the community. But I think that there's less movement toward that and more toward finding some land to lease or to buy to do a food forest on, or finding some space within the neighborhood of the community, somebody's yard, to kind of build it in that space.
Along that line, I often wonder because, we have some fruit producing trees on campus. It seems like people are, I know myself, are nervous about taking the fruit and there's no signage, there's no, I don't know, can you do it? Is it safe? Is it allowed? So I think that would need to be the education part.
100%. That's a huge piece of it. Of course, we tell children don't just eat things off of plants because they don't have the skills to discern what is a safe thing to eat and what is not. But we don't really catch anybody with that education unless you specifically get interested in foraging. I think that there has been a lot of good work done by, I'm blanking on her name. The Black Forager is her handle on Instagram.
Yeah.
Alexis Nicole.
Yeah.
Yes,
there you go.
thank you, Alexis Nicole, who has done an awesome job of highlighting the different plants you can eat, how to recognize them. Yeah, over on the Indian Mound, we have a beautiful persimmon tree that makes gorgeous persimmons. But another thing is like when you have to get them when they're the perfect ripeness, because otherwise they taste like disgusting sand. Yeah. The knowledge of when something is ripe, what is safe to eat, how to eat the things that are safe to eat. Yeah, all a big consideration, a point of education that I wish we were able to target more people, more like students coming up through the schools with that kind of information. Lucy has another question. Leanne said a latent hippie. Yeah, current hippie here. Yes. Lucy said, could you detail how your work balances the time poverty that individuals experiencing time and financial constraints with management? Yeah, this is kind of one of the ongoing problems of, like I said, you come home from a long day, you don't want to go pull weeds. You're short on time, you're short on energy, you're short on money. I think the solution here is just more connections with outside organizations, more partnerships. In an ideal world, this food forest within Western Heights would be managed not just by the community, but with representatives from Knox CAC, KCDC, maybe having a specific AmeriCorps position that's responsible for managing that space. And I also personally would hope that the police officers that are stationed in these public housing communities would also be a part of the maintenance of this food forest. I think that would help them connect with the community more. And how often do they get the chance to truly nurture something? But that, yeah, it's important to listen to the people in the community and to meet them where they're at and provide them resources to succeed, rather than coming in with these grand ideas and then you're all being voluntold that you have to be a part of this. So actually my thesis research that I am kind of kicking down the line for a while was surveying the community to see if a food forest would even be a good fit for the residents at Western Heights. They have in previous polls expressed an interest in, they're like, why don't we have any apple trees here? And I'm like, that's a great question. Why don't you have any apple trees? So yeah, and again, it's coming to the community and listening to understand before speaking to be understood. Is kind of where that comes to.
I'm just going to throw one more thing out there because you mentioned like the police getting involved. So in that research where they looked at the decrease in crime and such when there was that community, how long does that take? Because I grew up in a very small rural area and everybody knew everybody, but even there that's changing now. And it seems like when that changes is when you get this increase in in crime because people don't have that connection with each other. So how did they mention in that paper, like how long does that take? I mean, I
It's
guess
been
it would be a gradual thing, but
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked at that paper. If I recall, I mean, so there's some immediate effects from activating the space, from coming in and clearing out all of the needles and trash and putting in plants and green areas and green things. So already there's just you're less able to get up to mischief in that place because there are people there putting things down in the ground. So I think there are some immediate effects, but then also the longer term effects of, I think you hit the nail on the head, that community, knowing who the other people in that area are and feeling connected to them. I'm one of the people that believes that safety comes not from us having bigger, better guns, but from being more connected to each other and knowing who to trust and who you can rely on. There's definitely a balance to be struck. Actually, in the Western Heights community, when KCDC did a needs survey, they had requested a stronger police presence, not less of police presence, but that the police less of like a military presence and more connection with the community. So yeah, I think that connectedness is just key. And I think that there are both short-term and long-term impacts of greening a space.
yeah, it's really sad for me to hear that a lot of our trees that get planted are destroyed by college students. That
Yeah,
is, they should
the
have a sense of pride
average
in our campus.
Right. It's something that we've been talking about a lot in terms of how do we protect these trees. Of course, they're working on the urban forest master plan right now. They're in kind of the finalizing stages of that, I believe. And I was in a work session about that, and we talked about maybe like giving the trees a name and a social media account so that they have some identity and it's not just something destroyable in the landscape, but something that you can assign a personality to and imprint on a little bit. So there are definitely people trying to come up with creative solutions, but yeah, signage and communication and trying to figure out what is the value of a drunken college student and how do we convince them that this is something that's cool to protect rather than cool.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, but then again, even some of the food delivery robots aren't safe from drunken college students. Yeah, because I read that someone actually had to shell out a few $1,000s.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and you know that might speak to a larger cultural problem that we have with empathy and connection. But yeah, there just must be a way to protect some of those trees. It's so sad.
And apparently the robots.
And the robots, right? Save them all.
What if we get the robots to protect the trees?
There you go.
We're speaking, yes.
Yeah. Well, we are up on the hour, going a little bit over actually. And this was wonderful, Jaq. And this was a fantastic presentation. And food security is such an important thing. And coming up with creative ways to do that is great too. Because I think if you have the trees planted within the neighborhood so that people can actually forage for themselves, that gives them a stronger sense of security. And a sense of, you know, they feel like, wow, you know, we can actually gather our own food, at least at some level. And
You
that
get connected to the rhythms of the earth. You learn when things are ready and what signs to look for. And it's, yeah, that connectivity, it's huge.
yeah. So
Well, thank you all so much. I really am so happy to have been here.